Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is Dan, and you're listening to the Having Initiative podcast. Today's episode is Education Part 2, Alternatives. So, last episode, I really went in depth with basically K through 12 and a lot of concerns people have, and I try to bring them all together to paint a better picture. So this episode, it's not strictly limited to K through 12, but learning as a whole, and there's a greater emphasis on graduation learning, whether that's college or for a job in particular. And just a little note that I tried recording this episode twice, and I guess my outline wasn't very good, so I put a lot of effort into it. And so hopefully this is more coherent, but there's a broad number of subjects to cover. So the chapters for this episode are the school system, problems with college, tech has evolved, use it, having initiative, homeschool, and my experience teaching. And so let's get right into it. So the school system. Last episode I talked K through 12 and mostly in America, but a term that gets thrown out is the school system as a whole. So this goes beyond some would say that might be a federal policy, but so much of that of schools policies are set locally. But at the same time, there's a paradigm of how school goes that repeats itself all across the nation and largely in the West as a whole. So that is what they're kind of criticizing, the model that all of everything seems to be based off of. And of course, there's variability within it, but there's also a lot of similarity. So that's what I mean by the school system. So one big issue that I've heard with the school system is basically obedience, that what we do now with basically going to school and getting grades and the classroom environment, I've been told that a lot of that was modeled after the Prussian military system back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And a criticism of that is that it was designed to create obedient soldiers. So I researched a little bit of that, and because it's a little hard to find, and found out that at the time, the Prussians were one of the first civilizations at the time to truly make an effort for standards across their territory for education. And everywhere else, yes, there were means of learning, and some culturally valued it or whatnot, but I'm not getting too many consistent standards set throughout. And so, like in America, everyone has, not necessarily K through 12, but grade school, middle school, high school, and in them you show up to class, you get grades, that kind of thing, and there's feedback every level of the way. And it may not have been exactly like that, but basically the Prussians were saying, all right, across our kingdom, everyone is going to get some measure of exposure. That was the idea. And of course, it didn't happen perfectly, but they were one of the first to basically wanting to standardize that. And by standardize, don't get caught up on standardized tests. They wanted something that we apply this to everyone. And so I think they stood out. That's why they stood out, because development was a priority. So at first glance, that kind of research that it sounds good, but again, it was modeled after military training in a certain sense, which was to make soldiers obedient to authority. Now, outside of my and other people's concerns about government or tyrannical domination by creating a society that are solely obedient, it didn't encourage adaptation or innovation. So learning what came before was important, but it wasn't driving kids and then citizens to create and advance. And other military models would supplant what the Prussians were doing, which was kind of the standard at the time in terms of training soldiers. While they did have, a certain level of indoctrination in all military branches across the world, other things like decentralized command would come up. An example of this is the Blitzkrieg in World War II. They very quickly, instead of one single standing army, they broke up and advanced quickly, and they had a certain level of autonomy. And another example is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan Basically, within 24 hours, the Soviets had Afghanistan completely under their control. And a part of that was because they broke down into smaller units and they had their own tasks and carried them out, and it happened very quickly. So the criticism of the old Prussian model and therefore our current model, which was very heavily modeled after it, is that it's outdated. We have new things. And part of this might be the very nature of a classroom. I mentioned in the last episode that anytime you have a school with, hundreds or more, like over 1,000 kids, just going from one class to another, passing periods, the fact that at times classrooms can have, 20 kids or even less than that if there's a disparity in their competence at the time, all of these things create issues that make it harder to make everyone great. Let's put it that way. And so whenever people are talking about how they should teach this in schools, another factor that limits what we can teach in schools is time. And everyone has their own opinions on what is most important with that limited time in that framework that we have with the school system. So that's a big criticism. Now, further on in this episode, I'm going to talk more and more about if you're a parent and you have a kid, or if you're a teenager who has internet access and you care about your education. Basically, you have means to learn outside of the school system. So we'll get to that later.
And another quick point. So I talked about how our education system was founded on the Prussian system. I also found, at least in America, that J.D. Rockefeller, the famous, mega billionaire in today's terms, he got involved with the education system as well. I believe he and his family created the General Education Group, and it on the surface seems philanthropic, but there are multiple quotes by him and his business manager stating that its purpose was not to create free thinkers or philosophers, it was to create productive workers. And so, yes, I have those quotes, but I don't want to go too deep diving into the nature. But if that's true, then yes, our education system is a little tainted if we're still operating off of various things that they added. So just something to think about.
So the next subject is problems with college. So college or university, I'm going to say college for both of them. You can definitely acquire knowledge, but a lot of that I'm finding and others are finding is that it doesn't necessarily translate to working in the field you go into. And depending on the major, a college or university isn't the exclusive monolith that it used to be. So, a quick story about my college experience. I went to college for a time, but I had a lot of issues and I couldn't figure things out. So then I dropped out and started working, labor jobs. Later, I did a semester of community college because I wanted an associate's degree, but at the tail end of that semester, things changed and I didn't go back. Now, a couple of years more of working, it's hard to move up to better jobs without some form of education. So I thought about going back. And I met with what I believe is an advisor. And I showed them my 3 years of initial college and then that one semester. And I was going for an associate's in science. And I found it required even more non-science related stuff. Like whenever all the time I had been in college, I had been having to take various I guess electives or not related to the field that I have. And the very first major I had was biochemistry. And so that was mostly science. And then in the later years, I had to fit in more electives like foreign language, that kind of thing. And I expected whenever I was coming back for the third time to college, I expected there to be some things that I would have to retake or basically, repeat my efforts. But I found that number had increased dramatically. And again, I had taken courses in that area, which were legitimate, but they were saying they didn't count. By that, I mean the second time I was in college, that one semester, I took a Spanish course because I found that any degree that was going to happen sooner or later. You need that elective credit. So I took a Spanish course. And it was legit because I would talk to my family members, all of whom were native Spanish speakers, and they say, yes, your pronunciation is awesome. You got the grammar down. It's good. Fast forward a few years, whenever I'm trying to get a degree again, they say, okay, that one that you took for foreign language credit doesn't count. And on top of that, you'll have to take even more than was required at that previous time. So, yeah, I wasn't happy about that. And the big reason why, not because I have to do work, but the selling point for community college was that it's to help people start a career or just improve their lives. But I was being for like that accreditation that comes with a certification or an associate's degree that will then lead to a bachelor's or whatnot. But I was being forced to take courses that didn't apply to what the degree was about, science, and work that I had done in that field, again, that is not about science, didn't count. And so ultimately, I didn't go back that third time. And the main thing is that I didn't think that this was truly helping someone as well as they could. Now, earlier when I first started college, when I was biochem major, you need a lot of science courses, but you also need a couple of electives or humanities. And at the time, it was explained to me that these are important. And I do believe that as a citizen, those things have merit. I've talked a lot about philosophy and psychology in this podcast. But as I get older and I hear people talking about, the role of education or the cost of it, that kind of thing, the more and more I think this needs to be tailored for the task at hand, which if you're a science major, science. If you're communications, it needs to be useful for whatever field communications is going to go into. And I mentioned the field you're going into a lot and I know a lot of people, the adage is you don't use your degree for the job you go into. That happens a lot. But at the same time, the whole point of a degree in a field was to be knowledgeable in that field. And oftentimes that's because you are going to advance into that field and be a part of it. And so I found that at that community college, again, it was there to help people, but there were a lot of hoops that they needed to jump through that having spent time in the professional world and just being an adult, I found weren't helping. And I've noticed this, I've heard a lot about this and noticed a little bit of it going on when I was at university. I talked to a guy who got a computer science degree, which that's the field I'm in now. And I asked him about the basically curriculum. And he told me, some of the standard languages that any computer scientist should be expected to dabble in, and then a couple of obscure ones. And I asked why the obscure languages, and he said, because the professor that was teaching the course created that language. So, yeah, and now apply that to every other field, and remember that you're paying money for all of this. And one last example is that I've heard that MBA, Masters in Business, isn't what it used to be because, yes, there's a lot of knowledge to be acquired there, but it's not teaching people to be an entrepreneur, which, regardless the size of a business that you're going into, you need that skill. And so a lot of, kind of bigger businesses weren't smiling upon an MBA as opposed to someone who made a small business and had some measure of success. So that's what I meant about education. It's not exclusive to colleges or university at this point. And if so, that knowledge needs to be tailored to helping the individual. I also mentioned last course about high school. People want that too, about making it so that kids can get a head start on their future beyond just, taking courses for college. So I learned that a lot that is very useful outside of institutions. And in my job that I have right now, a lot of accomplished and knowledgeable people recommend online content that isn't a part of any institution. Now, in that frame, we already have the job and they're giving me supplemental knowledge. But before you have a job and don't get caught up on job, because the point is that somebody out there needs to take it, whatever group it's a part of, whether it's a company or something. If you're trying to get into their group, they want assurance that you will be an asset because bringing you on costs them something. And so accreditation, that's the tricky topic of learning outside of college. Because for better or worse, college is held up, or a college degree is often held as the standard of, okay, this person knows what we need them to know. Let's bring them in. Employers need a way to see what your ability is, and without a degree, that's a little tricky. So there are ways to learn, but proof of it is tricky without work experience. Okay, we'll touch up on learning outside of college a bit more in a little bit. So tech has evolved. Let's use it. In the very first episode of the podcast, I talk about how in the video game Assassin's Creed 2, the town crier, let's call them that, would disseminate information to the illiterate population because that's why they didn't have the printing press, so reading wasn't prioritized for a lot of people. Literacy wasn't valued. But at that time, learning was, a lot of people could learn things through apprenticeships, like that was their craft. They would meet with someone who knew something and shadow them and learn. And there were kind of institutions for knowledge and whatever that may be. So those means of learning, like an apprenticeship, we don't do that too often today, and we consider it often, for a lot of people, inferior to like college, where you're being lectured and reading a lot. So people view those apprenticeships as inefficient compared to what we have today. But at the time, before, a large literate populace, like Rome in their height had the most advanced society on earth, and everybody knew it. The Italian Renaissance, again, when Assassin's Creed 2 was going on, had an explosion of advancement in art and science, and people could still learn and do very impressive things. Like, take a look at the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and all of the things that were built during that time, and you'll see, yeah, most people at this time could not read, and yet they built all of this. So, on that note, there's a meme, I've mentioned this before, that shows tech back then and tech now, and it shows like a Ford Model T back then and a Tesla now, and then it says teaching back then and teaching now, and it shows a black and white picture of a classroom. The students are all lined up perfectly, paying attention, and then it shows a modern classroom with the students all lined up and paying attention to the teacher. So that meme is criticizing that we haven't changed education, but a slight, pushback against that meme is that in terms of displaying and accessing information, we have evolved, and we do use that a lot in our classroom. Back in that 100 years ago with teaching, it was all about what the teacher told the kids and what the teacher had access to in terms of like books or something like that. Now they can make PowerPoints, they have the internet, and they can use videos, all kinds of things to access and display information that wasn't used 100 years ago. And people are kind of knocking, like I mentioned, older means of learning and technology like apprenticeships. But here's an interesting parallel. We used to write on stone tablets to record information, or papyrus reeds that have been mashed together. And now, literally, we have this tech called tablets, which, again, we write on to an extent, but we can also access tremendous amounts of information and create all kinds of other tools for learning. So my point with all of this is that, yes, in some ways we do need to update and re-examine our modern means of educating, but we've also been using tools at our disposal, or we've begun to use these tools at our disposal that make older means of learning more effective. Because again, everyone has been focusing on fixing the school model that those other means of learning, apprenticeships and whatnot, with the advance of technology, are even more plausible as a means of teaching. And I found that apprenticeships are starting to increase, so that's a good thing. As I mentioned in episode 1, we have more power than ever before, so let's use it. Now, in terms of using it, this comes back to having initiative. I mentioned last episode, everyone involved in the learning or the education of a child or student has to care. And I mentioned my dad made an app for math on our computer that he used to track my progress. Now, like a year or two later, computer games started to come out, and some of those computer games were educational in nature, and they were really witty, and so I learned while having a good time. So math, all of a sudden, instead of having to do this, the like fill out these fields on this, white background or something like that, all of a sudden I was playing a game or saving the princess or whatever, and math problems was how you did it. It seems corny, but hey, it worked, and I go on YouTube and look up videos of these old games, and I find that a lot of people use these too. And my parents also tried to supplement my knowledge with other stuff. Over the summer, they would have me read like Shakespeare at times, and I was not, or before Shakespeare, it would be simpler things. But for the most part, I was not good at it for a long time. And then eventually I discovered this book called Animorphs, and you couldn't get me to put that book down. And it was sci-fi, so you'd be surprised by the vocabulary involved in that children's book. Now, my parents, that's an example of my parents. They wanted me to learn stuff that I wasn't necessarily enthusiastic about. And the contrast with that is like Pokemon came out my fifth grade year, and there were magazines and books about all things going on with Pokemon, and I got my hands on those, and I absorbed all the knowledge without being told to, and then I could remember it and use it instantly. So the a thing with education is the genuine interest in something versus compelled education. So genuine interest, if a student wants to learn something, I mean, we don't have a problem with that. They'll dig it up and find it. So basically making the compelled nature, that's what I mean by with the compelled nature, that's what I mean by we have better tools at our disposal, not just to disseminate information across the masses, but also to get it into get the individual to learn it. So we have, in this day and age, better programs than were available in the mid 90s, like I was doing. And we have basically better ways of tricking kids into learning. There's this concept called gamification that I'm seeing everywhere, which is, in short, basically taking a task or something and trying to find a way to make a game out of it. And this isn't just with kids, it's with adults as well. I was just at a soccer match and I saw some sort of either sports betting app, sorry, or statistics or something. And basically, as an adult, I've been involved in various other things where they are trying to add a game aspect of like getting points by doing something involved in it. So that's gamification. And these are adults again. And games work, basically. Lots of people like to play them. So in terms of having initiative, I saw examples of kids struggling with math. And so basically maybe instead of, just on a blank sheet of paper showing 2 + 2 = 4 or something, maybe we can look into the other ways of getting kids to do math, like a game. And another example is with reading. I've heard, boys or girls struggling with the reading material that they're provided with. There's lots, basically, in all kinds of fields and interest, books that are created now that they didn't have before. So you can find something that they are interested in that involves reading and get them to do that. So basically, with having an initiative, use it to find ways to circumvent the compelled nature of things and have it be interesting in a way that's beyond, you need to learn this to be successful. So in the age of the internet, we have lots of ways of finding things out. So to continue my Pokemon analogy, now instead of having to buy books, there are fan sites out there that have obscene amounts of information that are updated regularly to find out anything you want to know about Pokemon. And I mentioned before, or just now, about the new means that we have at our disposal for teaching things in a younger grade level. One of them is YouTube. I use YouTube for education a lot, and from time to time, for like math or science concepts, I've looked things up, and you'll find a lot of people putting things on their channel for free to explain these concepts. And sometimes in school, your teacher can be great, but for some reason their explanation isn't sticking. You can find another explanation that maybe listening to that one, something will click. And another place I've learned a lot is this entity called Udemy, and I've heard of Skillshare and other paid things. And oftentimes I've known people to upload content to YouTube and Udemy, and usually on Udemy, since it's paid, they'll put a lot more effort into it. So with learning stuff on the internet, the official source that's a point of contention. And it just goes back to like with a college degree, like how do we know that you really learned it? I looked it up on YouTube. Well, how do we know what you learned on YouTube is accurate? There's industry standards like safety or something like that, things that apply. And they want to know, okay, if you didn't go to college, how do we know that you acquired the information and understand it? And to be fair, though, the best content out there is made by people in a given industry. Particularly the education ones on YouTube, I mean, except for maybe ad revenue, they're not going to make money off of it. And so oftentimes it's a concerned math or science teacher that's like, you know what? I want people everywhere to be able to learn about thermodynamics. So I'm going to put these slides together and explain it as best I can and use graphics, that kind of thing. So that's not just for education, that's also for the basically adult knowledge for various fields. And so we're kind of doing this as a society, and I think it's catching on. But outside of a degree, how do you know if someone is qualified? Well, something that's becoming more common is basically a portfolio. So I found that a lot of people who have learned or self-taught who have learned on YouTube or Udemy and done their own experimentation, not just watching videos, they have learned the skills, they've applied them and created something that they can use in a portfolio that shows, do you want to know what I can do? This is what I can do. And in a lot of fields, I'm finding that, okay, just like with the MBA versus having a small business, that is better proof of, okay, this is someone who will be an asset to our group. And that's gaining steam. So I hope that takes off. And even if you can't use a portfolio for getting a job, that's the best way to learn is for you to do things on your own. It is a great teacher. Or maybe it's not the best way, but it's definitely a great teacher. Okay, so homeschool. Back to K through 12. I've heard a lot of people, talking about what's wrong with K through 12, and I'm heard a lot about homeschooling, arguments for and against it. So I'm going to try and stick to facts and assertions that have some measure of empirical backing. So I used to think that homeschool was just a parent who wanted to teach their kids and they just winged it, basically. I found out that that's not the case. There are homeschool, basically, curriculum that they purchase and they get sent supplies and resources and they use that. And that curriculum has had a considerable amount of effort put into it. Now, I've also heard concerns about socializing kids, and I've had those concerns as well. I just imagine that they spend all day in the house and it's just, the family, that kind of thing. But I've also heard that there's a lot of support for that too. Networks for getting homeschool kids to interact with each other, after school programs. And in some places, a kid can attend a period or two at a school for certain electives. And I've also heard about kids getting involved in community projects and various other ways of being around kids their age, but also interacting with people older than them. And that's a benefit that a lot of homeschool kids have that public school kids don't, is that they oftentimes have more interaction with people older than them. And so they develop faster in that sense. And then another positive I've heard is that if they have siblings, they get more bonding time because they're spending a lot more time with each other. So again, a lot of those things, we can't empirically measure them, but there is support basically for homeschool kids beyond just staying at home. Now, another concern I've heard is that parents aren't educated teachers. Most of them don't have a degree in child development or education. So the kids that they teach must not be as smart as kids who have had a litany of college educated teachers teaching them. But I did a little more research for people arguing for homeschooling. And according to the National Home Education Research Institute, homeschool kids typically score 15 to 30 percentile points above public school students on standardized academic achievement tests. And there are numerous other studies showing, on average, better outcomes with homeschool kids. So my point is, not every kid is cut out for homeschool, and not every parent is. But I'm mentioning homeschool because this is something that I had opinions on it. I investigated, and I had my opinion changed. I do see it as a much more, shall we say, I now see it as a much more realistic option than I did before. So just something to bear in mind. So, my experience teaching. Now, full disclosure, I taught adults online a little during the week and a big 4-hour block on Saturdays. And I did that for about 2 years. And I found in my time, overcrowded classrooms are always harder to teach people. You know, there's always going to be, just with the nature of having more people, there's going to be more people along various points of the bell curve. And it's hard to, let's say that everyone is enthusiastic, but again, their competence is on that bell curve. It's hard to take care of the people on the high end who we do want to thrive, and also take care of people on the bottom end and make sure that their needs are met and their questions are answered and their understanding is refined. And it's also works the other way. If I'm spending a lot of time working on the lower end of the bell curve, the people who are ready to go and learn more and do more advanced things are kind of idly waiting. And just like on whenever it's time to show up for class, if someone shows up and they are way behind, like I can go into that class with the best intentions in the world about how to teach everyone and how I'm going to explain things. But if they're way behind and they show up, that throws a wrench in everything, whether it's the lecture or whether it's time when I'm working one-on-one with people. And in terms of success in that environment, they have to want to learn. Being told to, they have to want to learn. If someone shows up and you have to tell them something to make them motivated, I mean, with some people I was able, like, again, there was a little bit of motivation there and I just brought it out. But if someone doesn't care, if there's a way to make someone motivated, I'd like to know, to be honest. And with teaching, you can understand a concept, but teaching is about getting someone else to understand the concept. And so you have to have different ways of looking at it in order to explain it to different people. And I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect teacher that can basically put any student in front of them and they'll be able to educate them. So you need variety, basically. And that's kind of the gist of all of what I've been talking about using different means at your disposal. And one-on-one with students, that's typically most effective. But sometimes if you're working something with someone and other classmates are watching, they may catch things that you're missing or catch on to the person in a way that you're not. So there is benefit to that, definitely, in a classroom environment. So my personal experience, education is complicated, and it's not solely a matter of one issue will fix everything. Everyone involved needs to care. So to wrap all of this up, there's lots going on with education. And I hope you found something I said useful. And the point I want you to take away is whatever is going on in the world with problems, you have more power than ever before. And odds are someone else out there is concerned like you are. So whether it's you or a loved one, have initiative and use what's in front of you. Or seek out things that aren't in front of you and use that as well. So thank you for listening to this episode and the last. This is an important topic, and I hope you found something useful. And so if you have concerns or anything about that with other people or disagreements, discuss. So thanks again, everybody. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you again for listening. This episode, just like the previous education one, was recorded months ago, or at least months before I'm recording what I'm recording now. So there's a few more things that I want to touch on. The first one, I talked about accreditation and how basically there are lots of ways of learning post-high school things, but a tricky barrier is, at least with if you want to be employed by someone else or gain the trust of someone as saying, I know what I'm talking about, is what's your credentials, which oftentimes means a degree or a certification or work experience in the field. But oftentimes, to get work in that field, you have to be accredited, that kind of thing. A term that was thrown out is the paper ceiling. The glass ceiling, you can see a goal you want to reach, but you can never seem to get there. The metaphor was there's a glass ceiling there that's, lets you see what you want, but prevents you from moving there. The paper ceiling is this thing that you have the skills you need for the job or whatnot that you want, but no one will take you seriously because you don't have the right piece of paper, a diploma, a certification to prove that you can do it. And I've experienced that a couple times in my life. And some of them, like, okay, I want to be a chemist, but I don't have a chemistry degree. Some things like that's like, okay, I can understand, even though I could prove my skills, they wouldn't look at me because I didn't have a degree. Or I was filling out a job application and there's that spot that says, what degree do you have? And I had to leave it blank. And so they have software that will filter out applications. And if you put no on that, then a lot of them will just throw you out without even looking at you. So I understand that, but it was frustrating. And then some jobs where they said you need a college degree, not a college degree in chemistry, like I said before, or better yet, there were jobs where I applied and it was basically a call center, and they said you need a college degree before we can even apply. We will train you on the job, and that will take time, or not even on the job, before you start the job, but you need a college degree. You don't need a college degree in literature or English or communications. You just need a college degree. And that, even back then, that was earlier on in my life, it was frustrating because I knew I'm smart enough to learn whatever you have, and you're going to train me on the particular. So why do I need that degree? And sure enough, years later, I got a job as a call center working at a large financial institution where I was given tremendous responsibilities, needed to know a lot of things about finance laws, and both internationally and within the nation. And of course, all the ways we can be sued. And I did fine at the job. In fact, I stressed myself out thinking about how serious it was, and it was much easier than I thought it would be. And most of the other people that I worked with didn't have a college degree, or they did, but they were having trouble getting into another field, so they settled for the call center job. So paper ceiling, they've kind of lowered their standards around it from what I've seen, but there's still a lot of jobs that it is a unnecessary barrier, in my humble opinion. And lastly, with this, I found that a lot of times, like if it's like we're talking about the chemistry example, the job application won't be decided by people who you would be working for or with. They're not decided by the chemists. They're decided by like an HR department. And they don't necessarily know what you need for the job. So that's another frustration, which is something we should probably look at as a society. So I talked about with resources out there, and I understand particularly with post-high school kind of things, the things you would get in a college degree, how you might be skeptical of learning things online, of course, if only because you can't get a certificate from it. But with K through 12, that's a gold mine for finding things online and using them because like I talked about with my parents, how over the summers my dad had to write a program to give me math problems to try. Now these days, there's lots of random multiplication problem generators online, and they're just a short search away. And my mom was pretty good with grammar and whatnot, and so she would kind of just used her knowledge. But if there's ever anything she didn't know back then, she would probably have to go find it in a book and search through, the table of contents and that kind of thing. And it might take a while to figure out the specific thing that she needed. Now it's just a short search engine search away. So K through 12 is a gold mine of resources out there, particularly with reading or English as a whole and math. Other ones like history, those are harder to find. So one thing that I forgot to mention this episode and the previous one is, well, I mentioned with my previous episode about government policies affecting education in a good or bad way. But the thing I kind of forgot to go in depth with is I don't know if like a school superintendent or like district level things are, you would call them government or politicians per se, but the superintendent sets policies for schools within districts, and then principals set policies within a school. I've had teachers talk about how they're, with principals in particular, some of them were good and they set good policies. They understood what the teachers were doing, what they needed. And if there was a teacher that wasn't up to slack, they could give them, they could help them get better, that kind of thing. And then there were other principals that weren't very good. They didn't know how to handle bad teachers. They didn't recognize the good ones, and they made them do unnecessary bureaucratic paperwork. And again, this is the teachers that they're affecting, and of course, that affects things. So that's something that I've heard from teachers directly. It's something that's not really talked about when I see like internet forums kind of things talking about what's wrong with education, and that's the entirety of my previous episode. And then lastly, in my previous episode, I talked about problems with children affecting education. And that's something that I see and hear more and more of. And with a lot of it, people ascribe the way to fix it is to have, counselors at school or have teachers better trained to do that. But again, like I said last time, these things really fall on the parents. And it's tough because, like I said, use the internet. There's so many differing opinions on how to raise children and to get certain outcomes. But there are some things that are a bit easier to narrow down. Like one example was I talked about video game addiction in the previous podcast that I did. And I was reading a book recently about child development, and they said video game addiction with children, or not necessarily addiction, just a desire to want to seek that out substantially more than other things. It can oftentimes be linked to certain kinds of neglect, or that the child is using video games as a form of escapism. So, with the tricky thing with that is, why is the child so intent on escapism? Sometimes they have narrowed it down to trauma. Sometimes they've narrowed it down to abuse or neglect, or just a bullying kind of thing from whoever that could come from. So, and yeah, there's lots of behaviors that children are exhibiting now weren't quite done in the past. And so sometimes I think it is like I've been advocating for the use of technology in this episode. Right now, I'm advocating for there are ways that technology can be detrimental, and we need to take a look at that. You know, there's the meme going on the internet right now where it shows a bunch of bikes in someone's front yard, and it said, "This is how we knew where the kids were hanging out at in the past." And it was just a commentary on how kids were more physically active and sociable with each other in the real world, whereas now, whether it's video games, whether it's communicating over social media, or it's just hanging out with a smaller pocket of friends, kids aren't interacting with each other as much more, and they're being isolated in a lot of ways. And I talked about previously with COVID how that's had detrimental effects that extends outside of classrooms. And honestly, even before COVID, this was a bit of a problem. Like I said, with technology, COVID just made it worse. So, lots of stuff going on. But again, I think we can deal with this stuff. We just got to take a good look at it and be a little brave. So, thank you again for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you'd want to support this podcast, leave a review or comment on the various platforms that it's on right now: Apple, Google, and Spotify. And of course, share this episode or others with others that you think need to hear it. And if you have any comments on anything that I have here and would like to contact me directly, I'm on a lot of different social media sites. I'm debating Twitter at the moment. It's either Having Initiative or Have Initiative on a certain short one. So Thank you again. I really do appreciate it. And I hope you join me next week where I talk about political alignment. That's one of my most important ones that I've done so far. So I hope to see you there. Take care. Once again, the 10-minute edition that you just heard was important, so I left it in again. Here's housekeeping round 2 for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. After listening to this episode, I really noticed more and more that there's less of a direct flow through the subjects, at least than compared to part 1. But I felt that all of those disparate topics, there was important things to say, and I hope you found benefit to it. If you're watching this, specifically what you're right now, then you're on a platform that probably has many free educational resources. If there's something that you want to learn and aren't getting proper resources, attention, or just know-how elsewhere, then seek it out. There's probably someone out there that wants to help other people and just releases information for free. And in this episode, I didn't even mention how I've noticed on social media groups that are made that are just a bunch of people trying to make a support network for some subject. Sometimes it's selling certain things like certain brass instruments that, use that kind of thing if you don't want to risk the Craigslist. Or there is also groups about education like homeschooling support, STEM, and more. I see people on an exercise one that I do that say, "Hi, I'm going to this city. Does anybody know if there are any of the group certified instructors there that I can use," or that kind of thing, or a gym I can train at. Bottom line, people want to help. And of course, people want to get help. You're not alone in wanting better education. So have initiative and seek it out. So, if you have anything to say about the content presented here, please let me know in the comments. If you want to support the channel, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And thank you again. I really can't stress that enough for taking the time to listen. And I hope you check out next week's episode about political alignment. It's one of the most important I've ever done on this podcast. So thanks, everybody. Take care.